From I Am Interchange, it's the Next Democracy Podcast. There's a word that keeps coming up when you talk to people who build software for a living. The word is fork. To fork something means you take an existing code base, someone else's rules, and you branch off. You make your own version, you run it your own way, and nobody can stop you. We're at Frontier Tower in San Francisco at the Next Democracy Summit. Ruzgar Imski is a Playnet contributor exploring organizations as games and games as organizations. How might we play organizations into existence, and in doing so overcome the division between game designers and game players, rule makers and rule abiders, between legislators and citizens? Kate Lee builds systems too. What if you forked a city ordinance? What if you forked a federal statute? If code is law, put it in a repository. Let people propose changes, real changes. Actual line edits, submitted by anyone, reviewed in public, merged or rejected with the record of why. And underneath all of that is a harder question she keeps returning to. Who owns your identity? Not your passport. Your digital twin. The version of you accumulating in systems you've never seen. Built from searches and purchases and patterns and memories you didn't consciously hand over. AI is storing that now, learning from it. And the person it knows best might be you. But you have no access to what it remembers. No access to your own externalized memory. I'm Tate Chamberlain, and I put them in a room together. Two people who build systems, and still want to talk about what those systems are actually doing to governance, to identity, the idea of sovereignty in a world where code writes code and AI inherits the keys. The game has been running for a while now. Someone designed it. It's up to us to change it. Today, Ruzgar, Kate, and I are on a quest to open source society and democracy. Join us. You two are AI nerds. I'm wondering what your relationship is to AI and hacking.
I have found AI to be a mirror and therefore an extension of my brain or myself. And with it, I've been able to move. My brain has always felt like it moves too fast for anything that I could do with my own hands. And AI has meant that I could basically program whatever I want to make happen in the world and make it happen at the speed of thought and decision making, which is super cool. And my relationship to hacking, I think the way I would describe hacking is like finding smart ways around programs. And I think of it more as creating and building. I think AI has enabled us to hack or to create around a lot more things. And I think the world needs more hackers.
I am myself also a hacker, and I experience the same thing now. I use AI, and I used to do programming by hand, and now it's more like intention-based. And it's what do I actually want to have happen? And I have to focus on clarifying my thinking and speaking my intention clearly is super great, because I always felt this too, that my thought process was not inherently sequential. It was inherently parallel. Like, I am thinking about multiple things at the same time, even if it's not all conscious at once. And so I think that's super cool. Yeah. And generally hack reality. Yeah.
With hacking and AI, there's a lot of concern around privacy and identity and how we exist online. Tell me about your digital identity.
My digital identity, we're tracked in like a gazillion different ways. It's hard to get around that stuff. Recently, we've been doing a lot of operational security stuff for the commons, and it's been hard realizing it's tough to stay anonymous. It's tough to own your own data. Very few people ever actually get to that point. But there are movements now starting within the digital space, like for local first, owning your own data, decentralized identities, self-sovereign identities, owning your identity, not having it owned by Apple or Google or whatever, having your data be portable so that you don't want to use their infrastructure, but your phone is not going to host this stuff. So you have to have it hosted somewhere, and being able to move it from one place to another, like that is this extension like a theme that keeps coming back for me in this thing is about sovereignty, right? Sovereignty over infrastructure, sovereignty over our own digital representations and our actions, and what kind of economies and societies can we create that enables sovereignty for everybody. Yeah. I'm a guy who spent a lot of time building digital coordination infrastructure for people to coordinate together and to create what they want to do. I'm part of this community called Playnet, which is a bunch of hackers and game designers and clowns and physicists, scientists who have been gathering around the idea of games as organizations and organizations as games, code as law, and meta programming as meta law, games that can transform themselves through themselves, organizations that can self-modify, playing organizations into existence. So instead of just like the difference between this divide that we experience currently in software development between game design and gameplay, right? Where there's the people who think of the system and then there's the people who live inside of it and explore within those contours. The theme for us has been dissolving the division between game design and gameplay so that gameplay can generate game design.
And to be clear, you're talking about game as an analogy or as a frame of thinking about reality.
Yeah, about reality, organizations, law, the matrix. What is the game we're playing? Or the game playing us?
We live in a system, and there's a lot about digital identity that happens at a systems level that as individuals we can't, unfortunately, really control. And so I've personally made my own trade-offs and just thought about it as there are bigger fights, such as thinking about who's designing the game that we're playing. If on the way there, the fastest path is to use some of these tools that might give up some of the digital identity, I'm not going to fixate on that and make that a bottleneck or a hindrance for me to get done the bigger picture. But I do think that there is one specific aspect of digital identity that is extremely salient today that I'm very passionate about, and that is around ownership over memory in an AI. A lot of people imagine AI as an entity, like this alien that remembers things about us. And if you have built or have touched agents yourself and how they really work behind the scenes, there's a lot more control and programmability around what the system remembers about you. And memory is not agnostic. Memory is not objective. Everybody remembers things differently. That is a huge part of identity, like how I remember something, what you remember about me. These companies are programming what should be remembered about a person.
How do I want to be remembered?
Exactly. We have sovereignty over how we think about our own memory, right? We organize.
Like as human beings.
We organize and we think about, we reframe, we learn in our own distinct way that is evolving over time.
Interesting.
And so if we think of it as an extension of ourselves, then we should have some control over how our systems organize our memories. And it's more powerful that way, I found, as well.
AI's memory of you might be different than your memory of you?
Yes. As of now.
Yeah, and I think something that touches on this identity question, right? Because it's like, oh, if we're claiming there are people talking about, let's make AI governance where you're represented by the AI in the governance process or something. And it's, oh, is this AI really a reflection of like how I actually think, like how my processes, how my memory structures are organized, right? Versus it's just something we're calling the same thing that's taken from what you created, right? You're sharing your expressions, your thoughts, your lived experience, and then it's created a replica that is not exactly you. And I think this touches on the question, is it about that it's actually the same, is it the same reflection, or is it just about the outcome that matters, right? So maybe it is a computational substrate, so I imagine it must be organized differently. I don't know.
It will be a little different, but I think there's actually something powerful about that difference so this is with our experience with coding agents, right? Like software engineers are at the frontier of experiencing agentic powers. And the most power users that I know are the ones who actively manage the memory, essentially, right? Like, how do you manage the context and the tasks for what you want the agents to do for you and why? And you actively organize
being intentional about the context available.
It's often like when we talk about interoperability, right. Like you can plug in an open source model and run on the same context. You can run Anthropic's models. You can run OpenAI's models through the exact same memory and context that you curate for yourself, right? And I think that's part of why people in the software engineering world has a little bit more optimism about the technology than the rest of society, because the rest of society is not experiencing that. They're experiencing
what?
This empowerment and actively curating the behavior of an LLM. And they are more so fed the dumbed down versions through this friendly chat interface that feels like this alien entity that you're talking to somehow just remember certain things about you with no concept of how it works behind the scenes, no concept of the difference between data going back to training the models versus data that's just stored and fed into the context of the system. And for them, it's this much more mystical, mysterious thing of, oh, how is it able to remember and do all that? They have no power over that. They're playing someone else's game. Whereas I think as programmers or as developers, we have more of the empowerment. I've done some workshops for what they would call normies in the tech world around this stuff, and I've often refrained from presenting the dumbed down version of, hey, just use this thing, just talk to it. It's more like introducing them to the concepts of local agents on your computer. How do you think through your file system like it's a program and bring the agents to you, not the other way around? And I think that's still tricky because the trade-offs between making something easy versus making something empowering is very tricky.
It's super huge. And like the whole onboarding curve, right, into this whole sphere. I think there's a big shift with the rise of this AI stuff where more and more people all of a sudden are able to just code whatever they want, barely with having to learn any programming. And in fact, learning on the fly, whatever you want to learn, you can learn on the fly. And then there's different interfaces, right? Like that we interact with this kind of stuff in, right? So one was chat interface, like another is we see more and more people downloading these IDEs, these interactive developer environments, right? Like VS Code or Cursor. Maybe these names disappear in the future. In the past and still present, the most powerful text editors on the planet, something called Emacs, but it's widely regarded to be the most powerful text editor on the planet. All code is text, all law is text, all knowledge we can represent. I imagine, not all knowledge maybe, but text manipulation. And I think we're seeing more and more people having access to this interface for being able to program their own reality. We're converging back on the same structures that have been in deep computer science for a while. For example, Lisp, father of AI and father of Lisp, John McCarthy. If you look that up, father of AI, father of Lisp is the same person. Lisp is a programming language, and it's the programming language that's the best suited for metaprogramming.
What is metaprogramming?
So metaprogramming is when you write code that can transform code, right? Or a program that modifies the program. Or, code generating code.
It's like a equivalent of that for a normal person.
So modern day, outside of the context of programming, law is the best. We have constitutions and constitutional amendment law, which is the law about how you change the law. And that's meta law. And metaprogramming is operating in that space, right?
Yeah.
Something I like to call the meta law interface has historically been in the hands of very few people. The meta law interface, like for the Chinese emperor, right? One person ruling over hundreds of millions of people and having the meta law interface to determine the structure of how we organize all of society, right? You got the Soviet Union, right? When they did their initial constitution, right? And they did series of constitutions. So you've got a bunch, but you've got millions of people participating in this process of meta law design, reform or revolution. At some point, you might actually play into a game. You might do metaprogramming to the point where your code, your law, you can't go back, right? So at some point we might say, new rule, no freedom of speech, right? And then, oh shoot, how am I going to express the next move, right? And so the beauty also of what digital tools give us, in particular like Git. Git is a protocol that developers use to create and navigate all possible timelines a code base can be on.
Version control.
It's version control, right? So we can roll back, like we can experiment with complete freedom. We can roll back. And so this is a massive tool for democracy.
I think often people outside of technology will think of coding as just a skill that they imagine to be, oh, you want to build an app. Here's a skill that would allow you to build an app, and think of it in the job context. They think of it in that skill context. I think the magic of coding and the magic of programming that a lot of people outside of it does not experience or conceptualize or understand is that it really is a little bit like playing God in your own universe. You're literally writing down the laws of how the atoms in this universe move. What are the laws of physics in this application? And an application is like a microcosm for a certain version of reality, a certain container for reality. With what you said about Git being almost like you can play on parallel timelines. You can play...
It is that.
And then dial it back. It's like you have time travel within this universe.
Multiverse. You're literally the creator of a multiverse of possible ways that we could organize and coordinate ourselves. And this tool, this ability, this meta law interface to be able to express how we want to coordinate and organize together. Now with AI is being so democratized, not just at the level people have had access to coding stuff for quite a while, right? Developer environments, they've been taken on and now more and more people are downloading them. But the knowledge barrier too about how do we actually wield all of these libraries, all these computational objects, all of these coordination primitives that people and developers around the world has been so open source, free and open source movement, right? How do we wield those? And now my mom is vibe coding. My mom couldn't do math and now she's learning this stuff and able to create stuff.
Which means more people can become the creator of not just the players.
Exactly.
And I also want to push on the point of, we talk about vibe coding, we talk about AI for coding. That's still, it's great and it's still in the context of the code being traditional software. But the definition of software has changed, right? What you're talking about, the legal system is the software of a society. That's always been a metaphor, but now it's not a metaphor anymore. Because anything that you can basically use to describe instructions for how a machine should behave is technically programming, or it's technically, in air quotes, quote, code. And just at a very grounded level of somebody thinking about how they can extend themselves in a job. Right? Let's take the most basic example of a strategy intern coming up with the strategy of an organization, right? The mental model for what the strategy needs to include. Therefore, how should decisions be made as a result of that strategy? That's code. That's a system of instructions around how decisions should be made.
Totally. And thought processes, how are we actually organizing ourselves? Like, even at the level of event programming, right? I'm hosting an event. What's the programming? What's the sequence of things that's going to happen? How are we organized?
Yes. And I think that the line between what's traditional software and what we've traditionally thought of as a program, like a grant program, a school program, right? That is becoming more and more of a spectrum where at different points of the spectrum, like the part where you're planning the event or planning the curriculum of a school, that's where there's a lot of human and AI collaboration where the program is both executed by the human and executed by the machine. But then there's stuff on the other end where you could use machines to help and collaborate on figuring out the sequence of actions that should be taken, but ultimately the actions still need to be taken by the human. And so it's almost like we're one collective computer shaping the game, developing itself, shaping the same way software engineers have always felt the magic of playing God in their own little universe. We can collectively shape our own reality on this whole spectrum from pure machine code to pure human execution. But throughout all of that, it's a self-generating, self-governing thing. I think that is as democratic as it gets.
And like in this free and open source movement of like code should be open source, like we should be able to see what the laws are that govern our reality, right? What is the Constitution, right? What is the current version of the Constitution? And that being able to be open source. And in this world, we were talking earlier about some of the kind of paradigms in programming that are now we're seeing reflected now into the general population. And there's some like values that like are increasingly coming up in the free and open source movement. Like one of them is reproducibility of your code base so that I can copy paste like a template like that. I defined an organization like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could actually define the organization of how I want to coordinate this music festival and that it was just a copy paste free and open source organizational template, game template that could instantly be created anywhere else on the planet by anyone without any like special developer maintaining things behind the scenes. So that's one virtue is like reproducibility. We talked about procedural.
What is procedural versus declarative programming?
Procedural is like a subset of imperative programming where what it must do. You're telling your program, this is exactly the steps you must take in exactly these order. Procedural is a subset of that, so it's a bit more structured, imperative kind of thing, but it's still procedures. You've got procedural programming, you've got procedural law. Procedural law is, what are the procedures you need to take? What is the exact form you need to fill out? In what order? In order to do what process? And then you've got the interpretation of judges inside of the law. But even that interpretation is happening within a larger procedure, right? Of court hearing. And so we've got procedural programming, you've got procedural law. Something we were talking about yesterday at this Next Democracy hackathon. Some people were open sourcing the law of the German government and putting all the federal laws on GitHub. So we have version control. We're actively inviting any listeners to this podcast to similarly put the code base of your government on GitHub or on Radical, a distributed version of GitHub, not under the control of Microsoft, so that we could do version control on them.
Will you dive into the specifics of Eric putting the German laws onto GitHub, and why is that important?
So on the one hand, there's the aspect of the version control, that the moment that we go from my code base is something that, my constitution is a piece of paper, we can't go back, we can't go forward, we're on one timeline, it's the timeline of this country, and in programming, we call it the main branch. The main branch of your Git tree, this is like the main timeline, and so everything else is a draft. Every other timeline, every other constitutional transformation of our society is just a draft that we then merge, and sometimes we merge and there's no conflicts. We make an addition to the law and there's no conflicts. Sometimes we merge and there's a conflict and we have to resolve the conflict. And then what's the governance process for resolving conflict to merging to the main timeline, right? With the Git, we get all that exploratory space. And I want to come back to your question about procedural versus declarative. There's that shift that's been happening, and programming has been shifting from imperative to procedural to declarative. Declarative is more intent-based. I don't care about the sequence of events that's going to happen inside of the computer. I just say, this is what I want to have happen, not how. I say what I want. I declare my intent, and then the computer figures out what the procedures are to do that. That reflects in our code, as well as it makes a huge jump when we start coming about how do we change our interface to the law from being procedural interface to a declarative interface.
And to highlight how interconnected all of this is, even at the level of prompting, or how you would work with an agent for an everyday person at their jobs. If they're going to use AI, how do they work with tasks? What is the definition of a task? Traditionally, tasks has been super procedural, right? Tasks has been go to this Google Drive, click on this thing, edit this thing, and all of that.
We interact with the computer, a set of procedures, like I got to open Google Chrome.
And we're basically told, our managers tell us, go do this thing. And then the procedures are written.
I got to file my taxes, right? Like all these procedures I got to do.
Yeah. And think of how powerful it is when, instead of thinking about, here are all the steps I got to go through to do, which in some ways is like, we're being programmed.
No, we're being told, like we're computers, to execute what we must do.
At work.
At work,
Yes.
in society, in terms of the state, right? It's like the state is telling us what we must do. This is imperative programming.
Yeah.
Imperative programming. I'm telling you what you must do.
Versus, we step in the shoes of the declarative programmer and go,
right.
This is the outcome I want to drive in the world.
This is what I want.
In the organizational context, a lot of people think about the future of work and the future of task management, right? How powerful it is when the unit of work that a person is assigned, which no longer will be procedural, because the amount of time it would take me to tell you what exactly to do, I would have done it with a computer, right? And so the task management can no longer be procedural. So then individuals actually become a lot more empowered to go be the declarative programmers of articulating intent. An individual, like their job is not to go execute on the social media copy. Their task is to drive the outcome of reaching however many followers. I'm giving the dumbest example.
Yes, but I think it's like a yes and. There's an aspect in which like 100% more declarative, more intent-based interface for us to express how do we want to organize our society and our production processes and our distribution processes, right? How do we want to actually organize those things? And of course, like robots can't do everything for us. And declarative programming, that's like a higher level abstraction. So it does, in the end, break down into a set of procedures. And it might be humans or robots that do it.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to, are the workers able to control their own production processes?
Yes.
I produce my reality, but am I actively transforming the way I produce? Do I have agency to change the world, or is it coming from some external power that's telling us what to do, even though we don't want to actually do this, and it's actually against our collective self?
I think there's something empowering about being in the shoes of the game master, infinite games, where we articulate the desired outcome, which then goes into the Git question, because I think it's interesting. How do open source projects manage to have a main timeline while so many people contribute? Right?
Exactly. It's a critical question for collaboration on these governments. Like, how do we govern? How do we merge and resolve conflicts in the timelines? Because
it's one way of thinking about it. People often think of and imagine the world of code and programming as this ultra complex thing. And in many ways, it is a more holistic way to manage a much simpler world, meaning the world of a computer program is actually much flatter and much simpler than reality. Reality has a lot more unknowns and a lot more variables. And so whatever has worked in software engineering, whatever has worked in Git in open source projects is like a metaphor or a microcosm for everything else that can now happen in society. And so it's interesting to study how does that happen in open source software, right? In a world where the projects that are going on right now with turning legislation into GitHub repositories, with even open PRs, which is like open proposals for what should be merged, right? That's super interesting, but that's still not like how things are actually governed, right? If we imagine a world, like just entertain for a second, but if we imagine for a second that the law actually works that way, how would it work? The main timeline, and everything else is just drafts, right? And people make copies, people make differences, and they try to merge it to the main timeline, right? Some succeed, some fail. Yeah. And then what the process for doing the merge needs to be specified within the main timeline itself. So I think that's also something that a lot of our code bases are actually missing right now, and we need to integrate into the way that we develop software. Yeah. We have these tools like GitHub, which is hosted by Microsoft, right? And then Radical, which I highly recommend for any developers out there. It's distributed. You're not under the control of Microsoft. They can't shut you down. Thank you. They can't shut you down. It's distributed. We need our tooling for doing the merge process defined within the main branch itself, so that the code base contains its own logic for how we're going to actually resolve the conflicts. That gives us the metaprogramming within the code base itself, instead of what we have on GitHub, where it's like, we have a preset way of how we define these companies. They all open up GitHub profile or whatever. They set up who's going to be the manager or who's going to be the roles. It's proven at scale. This is a way of organizing how we collaborate on merging code, and it works for these big companies, whatever. But there's no metaprogramming that's possible there. There's no, we can actually self-transform through our own coding process. Yeah. So branch protection rules. There's actually right now encoded into the software of GitHub a division between not just game design and gameplay, but between game design and the management of the administration of the code base. It's actually that bureaucratic kind of thing, which can be effective sometimes, right? But it's also not within the power of the developer to transform in any way. Meaningful, maybe. Yeah. So there are some ways in which that happens. Okay, I'm imagining it has to be a thing. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah, and I mean, it should be. In a similar vein right now, because a lot of programmers using coding agents, and there being some standard formats for how coding agents are instructed. There's the Claude.md, which is the instructions and the skills within a specific project. We are game designers, and game as this instance of reality. Game designers are also influencing how each other's agents are operating by making merges that include changes to the instructions for the agents themselves. So if you and I are working the same code base, I can change the Claude.md instructions, tells Claude what to do. So we manage our memory. We manage our collective memory and instructions for how the system should run, how the system should be programmed in the first place. Exactly. I want to make sure we bring this to a tractable thing. Yeah. Because I think thinking about this at the scale of government is there's a lot of unknowns and not even sure that as is we know what would be best for doing that, right? But I think there are a lot of microcosms of governance that where this is actually super tractable, like within a specific community, within a specific vertical, like food distribution. We have like laws in a sense, not in the sense of the legal law, but in a sense of like procedures and definitions for like how to do things, even within companies and businesses, where this is like super tractable experiments and microcosms.
I think it's like tractable in any dimension because of, hey, these code bases, it's like there's ways of navigating through this stuff. And I think from whether it be like an organization or whether it be like a nation state, it doesn't matter how big your code base is, right? And yes, like in terms of getting it most on the ground, sure, but I think there's already a bunch of firms out there that are doing AI, law, lawyer situation where they're trying to automate procedural law, where they try to declare an intent and they try to like, oh, what is the thing? How do I actually transform the state apparatus to actually achieve my desired intent? Right now, the people who are paying for that stuff, these are the people with the big money bags, right? Who can buy the lawyers, who can basically buy the procedural. Those are the people who prior to programmers were the most expert at the procedural systems of whatever, how we organize our society. So those were the programmers, right? The lawyers, like the meta programmers are potentially different, right? That's like the meta law interface.
Like the analog version.
Yeah.
Like paper-based organization versus digital. And yeah, so I think if we can invite you from wherever you are, take your organization, take your local community code of conduct, your school rules, right? The rules that govern your education, right? Your local laws, your state, federal laws, put them in Git, which is, again, not the same thing as GitHub. Radical CLI, radical, radical CLI, distributed. Yeah, do that. And then we can be free, explore, use the power of agents, explore the possible timelines, and make proposals, right? Because ultimately, you can recognize, oh, this is the main branch, and I can recognize that this is the current state of the United States.
The deployed law. We
could try to figure it out. What is the series of changes I need to do to make a proposal that will be compatible with a merge and the merge rules on the main line? That's the main question. And if it's not possible, sometimes the case, right? If the main branch had legislated itself to a point where merges are not possible anymore, or specific kinds of merges are not possible, then that's the question between reform and revolution within any given context. Not necessarily violent revolution, but at the level of this code base cannot serve you anymore. Or this main branch in Git, this is actually something we call switching what is currently the main branch, right? So usually we call the main branch main, but it might be called master. And then you switch, because now something else is considered to be the main branch.
Switch timelines.
You switch timelines because reforming within the same timeline is no longer possible. You need to switch.
But I think what's also super tractable for any individual to feel empowered with AI is applying this concept to any little mini universe that you're trying to create. It doesn't have to be you build an app, you vibe code an app for your mom. It could be you are thinking about how you want to hold an event, as you talked about with event programming. And then you turn that into something that's version controlled because you can play with different timelines. Essentially, programming is like specifying thought processes, right? And so you can have, oh, what would happen if I optimized my event around this way of programming versus I optimize my event drawing inspiration from this other organizer who did this.
There's paradigms of programming that have different ways of thinking about this stuff.
The unconference that was yesterday. How do you organize an unconference? What materials need to come out of it? That could be codified into Git.
And Git is for way more than just code, not programming languages, it's just text. So it's like anything in terms of facilitating group collaboration and drafting of documents of any kind. Git is an excellent interface for that. And the interface to using Git is really still too much not accessible.
Play with it.
But we need to play with it.
We can visualize it as a multiverse timeline.
Literally the multiverse. It's like Google Docs. If you've ever tried to collaborate with other people over Google Docs, writing out your community constitution, how is it you're starting this local club? Eventually, it's like too many people are writing on the same docs, or you split and you create multiple docs and then you have to copy paste between them. It's crazy. But Git takes care of it for you and you can create as many multiverse as you want. There are some repos that get thousands of contributors who contribute to them.
Beautiful ecosystem the rest of the world can learn so much from.
Yeah.
Just like open source software.
Yeah.
And
free and open source software.
Free and open source software.
As people open up to AI, open
source
the source.
The matrix.
I know throughout conversations, there's trepidation around letting AI govern us. You're pro, you're agnostic.
Are you pro?
Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Is there more to the question?
Nope.
Let's get into it. I think the idea of letting AI govern us feeds into that assumption of AI as some alien entity outside of us.
Yeah, like a subject that views us as an object.
Exactly. And I think people can point to evidence such as Claude Mythos escaping its sandbox and say that, oh, but it has agency. Yes and no. It is not some alien entity. There's no one AI imposing things on us and governing us. There are, at some level of abstraction, programmed the AI to behave that way.
Like what you were talking about with the skills, right? So within the code base, we have the skills, and the skills govern how the AI is going to govern the code base. And
Yeah.
I'm barely interacting with the code anymore.
Yeah.
I'm barely interacting with the procedures that we typically associate with programming, right? I just declare what I want, including transforming the skills of the AI, and then it governs the code base.
Yeah.
But that's very different from, I don't know, in the end, we're the ones who have the highest level interface,
Yeah.
I would hope.
Yeah.
And if it's the other way around, then I'm like, who's governing right now? I don't know.
I think losing control of it will be really bad. And there are real risks of that I don't want to dismiss. But to assume that it is just some higher entity when there's a literal company that's programming how it operates. Claude Mythos didn't do that just out of nowhere. It's not, yes, they put it in a sandbox and it escaped it, but there's prompts behind the scenes, right? The harness around the agent, right? And I reject the premise entirely of there's some AI entity that governs us. And I think it's more a tool to, and governance broadly, not necessarily only in the government context, but the tool that allows us to program thought processes that are now entirely human coordinated and codify and evolve the way software has, because the laws of governance is essentially a kind of software.
If we said, okay, we're going to put the federal laws of Mexico,
Yeah.
we put it onto GitHub, and we put a Claude.md file in there,
Yeah.
I feel like that's super powerful, especially now there's these skills, right? So it gets even more modular.
Yeah.
And it's, there's not
What are
just
skills?
So skills is context that you can give the AI. It's like a file that you can put inside of your code base under a skills folder. These are little modules. So it's not there's one way that AI operates inside of this code base, but I define a skill for maybe metaprogramming, or a skill for doing this particular task, or programming in this particular way, using this particular library. And yeah, so it's more modular and we're not bound to one thing. I think with the whole thing with free and open source anyway, is that it's all offers.
Yeah.
It's all offers. It's all free. It's all open source. You don't have to use this code.
Yeah.
And if it's really, it comes down at the hardware level.
Yeah.
Are we going to actually run this code? And who controls the infrastructure that's going to run the code? Because you can have developers working at Claude or working at Anthropic and they're developing some crazy AI. And it's okay. You can have developers having more agency. Yes, they're the ones who really control the AI in the end, right? Even in the case of AI drone strikes.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's who's actually running the program. Are you letting certain computational processes run on this infrastructure simply because the current code base of society says this infrastructure is owned by some private few people in service of their private few interests?
Yeah. I want to double click into skills, because I think it's a really powerful sign of it being so dominant as a way of organizing agents. I think that a lot of conversations that I hear outside of tech talk about AI in a sense of, oh, it can do data analysis, but it won't do it my way. Or they talk about it in a definitive good versus bad way. And it's like each of us as individuals, we have our own preferences for a given task, how we want it to be done. And we've often failed to recognize that there's no one way to do that task. And there is no such thing as the AI all of a sudden just being smart enough to do it your exact way. Because who's to say that your way is necessarily better than all of the others?
Right. Just quickly, this is making me think of nonviolent communication and the difference between strategies and needs.
Yeah. And I think that's just not, yes, there are some ways in which AI needs to improve, and it will. Probably within the next few months, it's going to get a lot better. But I think that it's less of a helpful frame to think of it as the AI is not as good at doing this, or the AI doesn't do it my way, therefore it's not good, versus, no, you are the programmer, you are the game designer, you are the game master. You have the power to shape the behavior of the machine.
Yeah.
And skills is the most widespread, powerful primitive to do that today.
Yeah, exactly.
Meaning,
what you were talking about with the memory.
it's like the same thing with memory, which is you get to define when you say that you want to create a data report. What do you mean? Your skill can start with just 5 lines of bullets of how you prefer data reports to be done. And then 10 days later, that 5 lines is now 500 lines composed into different files with different really thoughtful processes. You can do the best data report that you've ever done. Spend 5 hours sitting down there iterating until it's perfect. And then you can do that every time for every new data report. That's like multiplying yourself. If you are in the shoes of multiplying yourself, it's not the reactive passive frame of these companies are doing this to me. It's more like I am in charge of scaling myself and how I want to operate in the world. The great thing about skills is that it's not a proprietary format.
It's literally just branding, but it corresponds to the concept just digitally. It's like a skill you give an AI in a particular context. It's just a document.
Yeah.
Literally just a special kind of prompt.
There are a ton of open source skills that are on GitHub and Radical now, or just people's ways of doing things democratized to anybody who downloads it. And so that's a super powerful marketplace, empowering. And if the individual put themselves in the shoes of, hey, I am here to shape and create my protocols for the best version of any given task that I'm going to do, and I'm going to turn that into a skill, and now I'm empowered to do that every time. That is really empowering, and I think it's a much better frame than the reactive, oh, can the AI do this for me? Anytime you're like, the AI is doing this for me, it's not your agency and your ownership anymore.
Interesting.
Which
it's like you're actually not even remembering what it is you wanted done or how it was done unless you are, maybe it is remembering, unless you format it into a skill. Yeah.
And you make it yours.
And you make it yours and you make it reproducible, right? Coming back to the reproducibility thing. Yeah. For any of the programmers out there, I just want to drop a couple of references. In terms of reproducibility, GUIX, G-U-I-X, allows you to create completely reproducible environments instantly anywhere. It's a complete alternative to Ubuntu or Windows or whatever, entirely written in Lisp, entirely declarative, entirely metaprogrammable, and used for high-performance supercomputing projects, used to organize community gardens. It's an excellent project, an alternative to Docker. Shout out to the work of the Sprightly Institute. The Sprightly Institute has been operating with Lisp. There's an infinite difference in terms of metaprogrammability between Lisp and any other language. They created distributed transactional programming in Lisp that runs both in the browser and on any device. So we're talking mesh, distributed computation, storage, being able to program anything, metaprogramming, scaling programs to the size of the planet for free. There are so many ways. Think about how many times someone's been like, oh yeah, I have this great idea for this community sharing, lawnmower sharing application. It's okay, yeah, let's do it. And then maybe somebody does it, but then it runs on a server and that server costs money. And then it's, oh, I need to, in order to scale this, because I need to pay for servers, I need to charge people and have a recurring subscription. Okay, now it's a subscription-based service and not a free and open sharing platform for the lawnmowers in my community, right? That's just one example of countless examples where the constraints of programming have the constraints of centralized servers and centralized programming paradigms have made it impossible for us to scale the commons, right? The free, the open commons, like governance free of the interests of capital or private capital accumulation. And so Goblins is a language developed by the Sprightly Institute that is distributed. So you can create anything you want. You can create organizations. You can create games. You can create federated structures for sharing and resource sharing and collaboration and video conferencing. Whatever you want, you can create it. It's a generic programming language, and you can create it in such a way that is free, secure, unstoppable, and doesn't cost you anything in terms of server costs necessarily, although servers are useful. And so long as we're not self-hosting our own infrastructure, there's a transitional period where we might need to pay for servers. But generally speaking, I'm trying to make an invitation here to inspire. The time is now. The tools are in our hands, and we're looking at the first time for some of the most powerful technologies humanity is currently wielding that organize so much of our production and distribution and consumption processes. The organization of our productive life can now be organized without any interests of private interest, for social interest, for collective well-being, for climate, for the environment, for nature, for humanity. Like, these tools are in our hands now.
I want to address the point of local hosting, because I think a huge fear with AI is that it's in the hands of a few of the powerful people in the world. Yes, there are a lot of open source models, but as of today, most of us are still using the models from the most powerful companies in the world.
With the constraints those models embed, right?
Exactly.
That embed very strong political constraints, economic constraints on.
Exactly. I want to address that. What we're talking about with the skills, the memory, the stuff that you're talking about with the protocols, how things are done in the first place, right? Those are things that we have ownership and control over. And we know that for a fact. The thing that we don't have control over in the context of the frontier models is literally the matrix multiplication.
What do you mean by that?
So the inner brains of an AI model. Or like a frontier.
Like the black box that is how the Claude model or whatever these things.
As of today, the best models in the world are a complete black box to us. So there's a trade-off, right? The best leverage that you could have is probably to use memory and skills that you own, but you should probably still use the frontier models because they are just simply the most performative.
Yeah.
As of right now.
This is in the context of AI, right? To run local models for AI, you need GPUs and self-hosted infrastructure, but this Goblin stuff, this Sprightly Institute stuff, this is generic programming. If you self-host, in the US, if you host a server in your own house, on your own local computer, the government has no right to come and take your computer, right? This is not guaranteed when your code is hosted on a database somewhere else, right? Sovereign, distributed infrastructure, and also for AI stuff.
Yeah, I think it's important for most people to recognize and understand that it is very tractable, and probably within this year, I'm not one to predict timelines, but very tractable to get to the world where these highly performant systems we're talking about could be entirely open source and hosted in your closet.
At least for the GPU setup is crazy. A note for the listeners here is the distribution. You were talking yesterday about, is it an equalizer, the AI, or is it a force multiplier?
Yes.
And it's like, it's a force multiplier, and it depends who and how are we actually going to enhance the force? How are we going to wield this force? I think the growing gap between people who even have access to these tools, like you can download a free open source model for the AI, but the truth is the most powerful models, they're all closed source. It costs money, and there's so much of the world that cannot actually afford it, right? And I think it's for us in this time between now and when we have equivalent powers that are open source that we can self-host.
Yeah.
People in a strong economic situation to use and effectively wield these forces made available, which for us in some of the more developed worlds, right? Because poverty and inequality exists everywhere, even in America. There's incredible poverty here. And so if you're in a position to be able to, whether it's through your company, whether it's through credits that you're paying or whatever, to be able to wield those forces for the benefits of those who are unable to because of the way that we are organizing the distribution of that force, I hesitate on saying words like responsibility or must, but I strongly encourage. The tools now exist. Many people hesitate because they think if I go and I can't afford to work for the commons because how are we going to scale? How am I going to sustain ourselves? Now is the time to think, how are we going to sustain ourselves together, right? Community, providing for our own needs outside of the private interests of the few, and to use the powers that we have available at us, whether they be physical, mental, AI, capability-based, in order to strengthen the collective whole. We've got challenges ahead of us.
I'm Tate Chamberlain. This is the Next Democracy podcast. Kate, Ruzgar, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could have done 3 more hours.
Yeah, honestly, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's the show. Ruzgar is still building, still asking what it would mean to play an organization into existence, rather than just work inside one. Kate is still pulling on the thread of identity. Who holds it? Who edits it? Who profits from the version of you they've assembled without you? The fork is still open. Nobody's merged it yet. If this conversation stayed with you, and it might, It's the kind of thing that surfaces later, in the middle of something unrelated, when you're clicking agree on something you didn't read. Send it to someone. It's the kind of thing that gets clearer when more people are talking about it. The source code is out there. It's just waiting on the pull request. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. A special thanks to David Munir Nabti, Susan Karstensen, and Whistlepig Korean. Shout out to our media and production team, Jacob Desch, Amin Yarsu, Darko Sevilla, Samuel Emero, and me, Tate Chamberlain. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.